A barefoot child materialized from the mountain mist, screaming that her mother was tied to a tree and dying in the frozen woods, bringing a convoy of armored luxury vehicles to a dead stop in the Cascade Wilderness. She didn't know she'd just thrown herself at the mercy of Kim Jae-hyuk, the ice architect himself, a man who designed endings, not rescues. But instead of leaving her to the wolves, he led his armed shadows into the darkness to cut her mother down. Now, the militia who tortured this woman are about to discover that these mountains just gained a new apex predator, and he doesn't forgive. If this story already has you hooked, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow that'll leave you breathless. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love connecting with our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The cold came down from the peaks that morning like something with teeth. It settled over the mountain pass in waves of frigid air that turned breath to vapor and made the towering pines creak under their burden of fresh snow. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, dark and watchful, ancient trees standing like silent witnesses to whatever violence might unfold. Nothing moved in that landscape except the wind. Nothing broke the crystalline silence until the convoy appeared. 3 black Mercedes Maybachs rolled through the slush with the purr of expensive machinery, armor-plated and bulletproof, moving in perfect formation like predators on the hunt. The vehicles looked carved from shadow and steel, chrome gleaming dully through the mist that clung to the asphalt. Tinted windows reflected only white sky and dark trees, revealing nothing of what moved inside. They commanded the road completely, as if they owned not just the pavement but the very mountains themselves. Then she appeared. The little girl came stumbling out of the tree line like something that had clawed its way back from death. Her dusty rose dress was torn and black with mud that might have been dirt or might have been dried blood. She ran barefoot down the center of the road, her small feet slapping against the wet pavement, leaving prints that looked disturbingly dark against the gray. Her arms pumped frantically, her breath tearing from her chest in ragged gasps that echoed in the cold air. She wasn't jogging. She wasn't playing some mountain child's game. She was running for her life, and every movement screamed it. Her hair hung in matted ropes across her face, dark braids coming undone and tangled with pine needles and debris. When she stumbled, catching herself on trembling hands before lurching upright again, the sound of her palms hitting pavement cracked through the silence like a gunshot. She ran until she saw them, then she ran faster, as if those black vehicles were her last hope on earth. Please. The word ripped from her throat, raw and desperate, shattering the mountain quiet. Please, somebody help me. The lead Mercedes stopped first. Not gradually, not cautiously, but with immediate precision, as if the driver had been expecting something exactly like this. The door opened before the engine fully quieted, and a man stepped out into the cold with the unhurried grace of someone who had never hurried for anything in his life. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a charcoal suit so dark it looked black in the muted light. No tie. The jacket hung open, and even from a distance, the intricate tattoos were visible ink that crawled up his neck in bold patterns, symbols and script that spoke of blood oaths and territories claimed. More ink decorated both hands, visible as he straightened his cufflinks with deliberate calm. His dark hair was slicked back severely, his face all sharp angles and sharper assessment. He looked expensive in the way weapons look expensive, beautiful, precise, and absolutely lethal. His name was Kim Jae-hyuk, and in the underworld that stretched from Seoul to Seattle, that name carried the weight of glaciers. They called him the Ice Architect. He didn't build empires. He designed the end of anyone who threatened them. Behind him, 2 more doors opened in synchronized silence. 3 men emerged, each in dark suits with white shirts and ties, each moving with the same disciplined precision that marked them as far more than bodyguards. They spread out naturally across the road, hands resting near concealed weapons beneath their jackets, eyes scanning the fog-choked tree line with the practiced vigilance of soldiers who'd survived by assuming every shadow held a threat. These weren't hired muscle. They were extensions of Jae-hyuk's will, trained to kill and die on his word alone. The little girl stumbled toward Jae-hyuk, her legs finally betraying her completely. She collapsed to her knees 3 feet from his polished Italian leather shoes, mud splashing across the pavement in dark streaks. Her small hands shot out toward him, fingers curled like claws, reaching for salvation. "They tied my mom to a tree," she sobbed, the words tumbling out between gasps that shook her entire frame. "Please, you have to save her. Please, mister. Please." Jae-hyuk looked down at her without moving, his expression utterly unreadable. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach out. He simply studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing, not the rope burns circling her thin wrists like brutal bracelets, not the way her entire body shook with exhaustion and terror beyond anything a 7-year-old should know, not the dirt caked under her fingernails from clawing at something or someone. He was reading her the way a surgeon reads a wound, clinical and cold. One of his men, Min-ho, stepped forward. "Boss." Jae-hyuk raised one hand. The word died instantly. Silence fell like a curtain, and the little girl's sobs filled the void, desperate and broken, the only sound for miles. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking into something that wasn't quite human anymore. "She's still there. They left her hanging. Please." Jae-hyuk tilted his head slightly, still watching her, calculating something behind those cold eyes. The child wasn't hysterical. She was traumatized. There was a difference, and he'd seen enough of both to know which was which. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet and utterly controlled, carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Where?" The girl lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the forest, toward a wall of dark pines that disappeared into mist so thick it looked solid, impenetrable. "In there," she gasped. "Not far. I ran so fast." Her voice broke completely, and she doubled over, pressing her muddy forehead against the cold pavement, as if the earth itself might offer mercy. Jae-hyuk glanced at his men, and something unspoken passed between them, a decision made in the space between heartbeats. He reached into the Mercedes and pulled out a tactical vest, shrugging into it with practiced efficiency. Min-ho was already moving, distributing thermal goggles to the team, checking weapons with the quiet precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times before. No one questioned the order. No one hesitated. When the ice architect decided to move, you moved with him, or you got left behind in the cold. "Stay with the vehicles," Jae-hyuk said to the youngest guard. Then he looked down at Gianna. The little girl had stopped crying, her eyes wide and desperate, watching him like he was the last light in a dying world. He stripped off his charcoal suit jacket, custom-tailored, worth more than most people's monthly salary, and draped it around her small shoulders. It swallowed her completely, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the hem pooling around her bare feet. "You're safe now. Understand?" She nodded, clutching the fabric like a lifeline. Then Jae-hyuk turned toward the forest, and the man who'd stepped out of that Mercedes ceased to exist. What moved into those trees was something else entirely, something older, something that belonged to shadow and silence, and the kind of violence that left no witnesses. The woods swallowed them whole. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees beneath the canopy, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic that Jae-hyuk recognized immediately as blood. The team moved in diamond formation, boots barely making sound against the frozen ground, breath controlled and shallow. Min-ho had point, his thermal goggles painting the world in shades of green and black, tracking heat signatures through the dense undergrowth. Jae-hyuk was center, his hand resting on the grip of the pistol holstered beneath his vest, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and exit strategies and how many men they'd encounter. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like something alive and angry, whipping snow into their faces and making the branches creak overhead. But beneath that chaos, Jae-hyuk's team was absolute silence ghosts moving through a graveyard, lethal and focused. They communicated with hand signals, with the tilt of a head, with the kind of wordless understanding that came from years of operating in the dark spaces between legal and necessary. Half a mile in, Min-ho raised his fist. Everyone stopped. He pointed ahead, and Jae-hyuk saw it through his own thermal optics. A heat signature, weak and flickering, suspended in the center of what looked like a clearing. Human, female, barely alive. They approached in a tightening circle, weapons raised, scanning for secondary threats. The clearing opened before them like a wound in the forest, and what Jae-hyuk saw there made something cold and vicious coil in his chest. Brenda Moore hung from a massive pine tree that had been split down the middle by lightning, the scar running through its trunk like a black river. Her wrists were bound with rough rope that had cut deep into her skin. The bindings looped over a thick branch high above her head, forcing her onto her toes. Her body swayed slightly in the wind, her head bowed forward, dark hair hanging in a curtain that hid her face. She wore jeans and a torn sweater, both soaked through, clinging to her frame. Her skin had taken on a blue-gray tinge that spoke of hypothermia, of a body shutting down one system at a time. But even like this, broken and suspended, there was something in the set of her shoulders that screamed defiance, a woman who'd fought until fighting was impossible, who'd refused to beg even when begging might have saved her. The snow around the base of the tree had been trampled into a muddy circle, boot prints everywhere, evidence of multiple men who'd stood here and watched her suffer. Jae-hyuk counted at least 6 distinct sets of tracks, maybe more. His jaw tightened. "Clear the perimeter," he said, his voice barely a whisper but carrying absolute authority. His men melted into the trees, becoming shadows again, leaving him alone in that clearing with the woman who was supposed to be dead. Jae-hyuk approached the tree, his boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow. He pulled a ceramic folding knife from his vest. Matte black, razor sharp, designed to cut through anything without making sound. "Brenda?" His voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the cold calculation in his eyes. "Can you hear me?" Her head lifted slowly, painfully, and Jae-hyuk found himself looking into eyes the color of warm honey, hazed with pain and shock but still fiercely aware. She was beautiful in the way broken things are, beautiful all sharp edges and survival, and the kind of strength that comes from refusing to die when dying would be easier. Her skin was a deep, rich brown that should have been warm but was now pallid from cold, her full lips cracked and bleeding, her high cheekbones stark against her face. She looked at him like she couldn't quite believe he was real. "Gianna." The name came out as barely a breath. "Run." "She's safe," Jae-hyuk said, reaching up to saw through the primary rope. The blade worked quickly, efficiently, cutting through the fibers with surgical precision. "I've got you." The rope snapped. Brenda's weight dropped, and Jae-hyuk caught her, one arm around her waist, the other supporting her back as she collapsed against his chest. She was freezing, her body shaking violently, but she was alive. She smelled like wood smoke and terror and copper, the scent of blood mixing with pine and cold earth. He smelled like gunpowder and frost and expensive cologne, a combination that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. For a moment, they were suspended their predator and prey, savior and saved, two people who should never have met existing in a space that felt impossibly intimate despite the violence surrounding them. Her weight settled against him, and Jae-hyuk felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not even compassion. Something darker, more possessive, mine to protect, mine to keep safe, mine. He pushed the thought away violently. Then he saw it, a red laser dot dancing across his shoulder, painting him in the crosshairs. Crack! A bullet shattered the bark of the pine inches from Jae-hyuk's head, splinters exploding outward in a deadly spray. He didn't think. He moved on instinct, spinning Brenda behind the thick trunk of the lightning-scarred tree, using his body as a shield between her and wherever that shot had come from. His back was exposed, his vest the only thing between him and a bullet, but he didn't care. He covered her completely, one hand cradling her head against his chest, the other reaching for his weapon. "Contact left," Minho's voice roared through the clearing, shattering the silence. The forest erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes flickered among the trees like angry fireflies, illuminating figures in tactical gear who'd been waiting in the shadows. Jae-hyuk's men returned fire immediately, the suppressed weapons making sounds like lethal whispers, professional and controlled even in the middle of hell breaking loose. Rounds punched through bark, thudded into snow, whined off rocks. Someone screamed in the distance, a high, abbreviated sound that cut off abruptly. Jae-hyuk stayed low, his body still covering Brenda, feeling her shallow breathing against his chest, feeling the way she tried to pull away to give him room to fight but didn't have the strength. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice hard and cold, the gentle tone from before completely gone. This was the Ice Architect speaking now, a man who'd survived 2 decades in the underworld by being faster, colder, and infinitely more ruthless than anyone who came at him. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Jae-hyuk watched his men work through the gap between the tree and his arm. They weren't just shooting, they were executing a tactical formation, advancing on the enemy positions with the coordinated lethality of a pack taking down prey. One hostile went down, then another. A third tried to run and made it maybe 10 feet before Minho's rifle spoke, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Then, as suddenly as it started, it ended. The forest returned to heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the wind and the sound of brass casings tinkling against frozen ground. "Clear," Minho called out, his voice echoing through the trees. Jae-hyuk didn't move immediately. He stayed there, covering Brenda, his heart pounding against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with the woman trembling in his arms. Then he pulled back, looking down at her. Her honey-colored eyes met his, wide and shocked, and something else, something that looked disturbingly like trust. "Can you walk?" he asked. She shook her head weakly. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing. She was small in his arms, fragile in a way that made that possessive thing in his chest coil tighter. He turned toward the direction they'd come, toward safety, toward the vehicles and Gianna and medical attention. His men formed up around him automatically, creating a protective box as they moved back through the forest. They made it to the SUV in what felt like seconds and hours simultaneously. The young guard had kept Gianna inside the vehicle, the little girl's face pressed against the window, tears streaming down her cheeks. The door opened, and Jae-hyuk carefully laid Brenda across the heated leather seats. Her eyes were starting to close, shock and hypothermia dragging her under. "Medic," Jae-hyuk snapped, and Minho was already on the phone, barking coordinates to their private doctor. Brenda's hand shot out suddenly, her bloody fingers clutching at Jae-hyuk's lapel with surprising strength, pulling him down so close he could feel her breath against his face. Her honey eyes locked onto his with desperate intensity. "They didn't just want me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and breaking. "They wanted the book." Then her eyes rolled back, her grip went slack, and she collapsed into unconsciousness, leaving Jae-hyuk kneeling there in the open door of his Mercedes with blood on his suit and a mystery that was about to change everything. The drive blurred into fragments, flashes of streetlights through tinted windows, the soft hum of expensive machinery, voices speaking in Korean that Brenda's fading consciousness couldn't parse. She registered warmth, finally blessedly warm, and the feeling of small fingers gripping hers. Gianna. Her daughter was crying, saying something over and over, but the words wouldn't land. Everything felt distant, like she was watching her own life through foggy glass. There were hands on her clinical, efficient, checking her pulse, wrapping her wrists in gauze that smelled like antiseptic. A needle pierced her arm, and liquid fire spread through her veins before the world went mercifully black. When Brenda's eyes opened again, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was smooth and white, recessed lighting casting a soft amber glow that felt almost golden. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft, the kind of softness that only came from sheets with thread counts she couldn't even imagine. Egyptian cotton or silk or something equally ridiculous. The air smelled clean, not hospital clean with its sharp chemical bite, but filtered and temperature-controlled, carrying the faint scent of sandalwood and something else she couldn't identify. The hum of central air whispered through hidden vents, a constant white noise that felt both soothing and unsettling. She tried to sit up and pain lanced through her shoulders, her wrists, her everything. A soft gasp escaped her lips as she fell back against the pillows. Her hands were bandaged, wrapped in pristine white gauze from palm to mid-forearm. She wore clothes that weren't hers, a soft cotton shirt, loose-fitting pajama pants, both in neutral gray. Someone had undressed her. Someone had seen her vulnerable and broken and had cleaned her wounds and put her in these clothes while she was unconscious. Panic clawed up her throat. Where was she? Where was Gianna? The room came into focus slowly. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated one wall, offering a view of a city skyline she recognized as Seattle, the Space Needle visible in the distance, lights twinkling like stars brought down to Earth. The furnishings were minimalist but expensive. A sleek dresser in dark wood, a chair upholstered in charcoal linen, abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than her car used to. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't even a hotel. This was someone's home, and judging by the view and the quality of everything around her, that someone had the kind of money that made regular people irrelevant. The door opened without warning, and Brenda's heart slammed against her ribs. But it was Gianna who came through, and the sight of her daughter alive, clean, wearing new clothes and carrying a plate of food made something break open in Brenda's chest. "Mama!" Gianna ran to the bed, carefully setting the plate on the nightstand before climbing up beside her mother. She was crying, but they were relief tears, joy tears, the kind that came after the world stopped ending. "You're awake. You're awake. The doctor said you'd be okay, but I was so scared." Brenda pulled her daughter close with her bandaged hands, breathing in the scent of her hair lavender shampoo. Not the cheap stuff they used at home, but something expensive and gentle. Gianna felt warm and solid and real, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. "I'm okay, baby. I'm right here. The man saved us," Gianna whispered against her mother's shoulder. "The one with the scary eyes. He carried you all the way back and he told me you'd be safe, and he was right, Mama. He was right. The man with the scary eyes." Brenda's memory supplied images in jagged pieces, a convoy stopping in the mist, a tall figure in a charcoal suit, the feeling of falling and being caught, the smell of gunpowder and frost. Kim Jae-hyuk, the ice architect. She'd heard that name before, whispered in the kinds of places where her late husband used to do business, always with a mixture of respect and fear. A crime lord, a killer, the kind of man you avoided if you valued your life, and she was in his home. "Where are we?" Brenda asked, her voice hoarse. "The penthouse," Gianna said, as if that explained everything. "There's a chef who made me pasta, and it was the best thing I ever ate, and there's a lady who speaks funny, but she's nice, and there's guards everywhere, but they don't talk to me, they just watch." Guards. Of course there were guards. Brenda's heart started racing again, that trapped feeling climbing back up her spine. She looked around the room with new eyes, no visible locks on the door, but that meant nothing. The windows probably didn't open. The entire floor was likely secured with the kind of technology that made escape impossible. She wasn't a guest. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. "Gianna, honey, go finish your dinner, okay? Let Mama rest a little more." Her daughter hesitated, then nodded, climbing down from the bed and retrieving her plate. She paused at the door, looking back with those big, trusting eyes. "He's not scary, Mama. Not to us. He promised he'd keep us safe." Then she was gone, and Brenda was alone with her thoughts and her bandaged wrists and the growing realization that she had no idea what came next. She forced herself out of bed, her legs shaky but functional. The pajama pants were too long, pooling around her bare feet as she moved toward the window. The city sprawled below her, thousands of lights in the darkness, a world that felt impossibly far away despite being right there beyond the glass. She was maybe 30 stories up, maybe more. High enough that jumping wasn't an option. High enough that the only way out was through whoever controlled the elevators. "You should be resting." The voice came from behind her, smooth and cold and absolutely commanding. Brenda spun, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard footsteps. He'd just appeared like a shadow taking form, and now Kim Jae-hyuk stood in the doorway of her room, her prison, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. He'd changed since the forest. The tactical vest was gone, the weapons no longer visible, though Brenda had no doubt he was still armed. He wore black slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with intricate tattoos that seemed to move in the amber light. She could see the edge of a dragon's tail curling around his left wrist, scales rendered in gold and black ink, the craftsmanship absolutely stunning. His hair was still slicked back, his face all sharp angles and sharper assessment, but there was something different in the way he looked at her now, something that made her skin prickle with awareness. He moved into the room with that same unhurried grace she remembered from the forest, crossing to stand by the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands in his pockets, his back to the city lights. The position put him in silhouette, made him look less like a man and more like a thing carved from shadow and threat. "How are your wrists?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her bandaged hands. "Fine." It was a lie, and they both knew it. They throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of rough rope and hours suspended in the cold. "The doctor said you were lucky. Another hour and you would have lost function in your hands. Nerve damage." He said it clinically, like he was discussing the weather, but something in his eyes suggested the information bothered him more than he'd admit. "Thank you," Brenda said, because what else could she say? "For saving us, for getting Gianna out. Don't." The word cut through the air like a blade. "Don't thank me, Mrs. Moore. You're not here because I'm a good man. You're here because those men made you my problem, and I don't leave my problems unfinished." She stared at him, trying to read past the ice in his voice, trying to understand what he wanted from her. "Then what am I? A witness? Collateral? What happens now?" Jae-hyuk tilted his head, studying her with the intensity of a predator deciding whether something was prey or threat. He moved closer, each step deliberate, until he stood within arm's reach. She could smell that combination of scents again. Expensive cologne, the ghost of gunpowder, something darker underneath. His presence filled the space around her, made the room feel smaller, made her acutely aware of how little she was wearing, how vulnerable she must look with her bandaged hands and borrowed clothes. "You were dead in those woods, Mrs. Moore," he said softly, his voice dropping to something that felt almost intimate despite the coldness in it. "The moment those men tied you to that tree, you stopped existing. But I brought you back. I gave you breath and warmth and safety. So now you're here, in my home, under my protection." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Do not mistake comfort for freedom. You're not a guest. You're an investment I'm protecting until I understand exactly what you know about this book." The possessiveness in his tone sent ice and heat warring through her veins. He wasn't touching her, wasn't threatening her, but she felt trapped anyway, caught in the gravity of a man who moved through the world like he owned it. "I don't know anything about a book," she whispered. His smile was cold and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. "Then we're going to find out what you know that you don't know you know. And until then, Mrs. Moore, welcome to your gilded cage." The doctor arrived at dawn, a severe woman in her 50s who spoke minimal English and examined Brenda's wounds with efficient, impersonal hands. She declared the bandages needed changing twice daily, demonstrated the technique to a member of the household staff, a quiet woman named Sun-hee, and left instructions in Korean that Brenda couldn't understand. When Sun-hee approached with fresh gauze and antiseptic, Brenda pulled her hands away instinctively, shaking her head. "I can do it myself," she said, though she knew it was a lie. Her fingers were stiff, the pain radiating up her forearms with every movement. Sun-hee looked uncertain, glancing toward the doorway where Jae-hyuk had appeared like a shadow materializing from smoke. He spoke to her in Korean, his tone brooking no argument, and the woman bowed slightly before leaving, taking her supplies with her. The door closed with a soft click that sounded disturbingly final. "You're being stubborn," Jae-hyuk said, crossing the room with that predatory grace that made Brenda's pulse quicken for reasons she refused to examine. He carried a medical kit in one hand, the kind with military precision stamped all over it. "I don't need help." "You do." He gestured toward the adjoining bathroom, all marble and chrome and the kind of luxury Brenda had only seen in magazines. "Come." It wasn't a request. Brenda found herself following him anyway, her bare feet silent against the heated floors, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bathroom was massive, a glass-enclosed shower that could fit 4 people, a soaking tub that looked carved from a single piece of stone, mirrors that reflected infinite versions of her exhausted, frightened face. Jae-hyuk set the medical kit on the counter beside the sink, then reached for his holster, removing it with practiced ease and placing it within arm's reach. The gun sat there, matte black and lethal, a reminder of exactly who she was dealing with. He turned on the tap, testing the water temperature with his fingers before gesturing for her to approach. Hands. Brenda stepped closer, close enough to smell that combination of scents that seemed permanently attached to him, sandalwood and frost, and something darker that made her think of violence kept on a tight leash. She extended her bandaged hands, and he began unwrapping the gauze with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers working with the precision of someone who'd done this before. The bandages peeled away, revealing raw, angry flesh where the rope had cut deep, bruising that spread in purple-black blooms across her brown skin. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. When he looked up at her, his dark eyes had gone absolutely black, and what she saw there wasn't pity. It was rage, cold and controlled and terrifying in its intensity. "This shouldn't have happened to you," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that could cut glass. He guided her hands under the warm water, and Brenda hissed at the initial sting, but his touch remained gentle. One hand supporting her wrist while the other carefully cleaned the wounds, washing away dried blood and antiseptic residue. Steam rose around them, filling the bathroom with mist that made everything feel dreamlike, unreal. She watched his face as he worked the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell slightly forward, the intricate tattoos visible at his collar, where the dragon's head seemed to be climbing toward his throat. He reached for the antiseptic, and Brenda braced herself. The liquid fire when it touched her raw skin made her gasp, her body going rigid, tears springing to her eyes. Jae-hyuk's hand tightened fractionally on her wrist, not restraining but steadying, his thumb moving in a slow circle against the inside of her forearm where the skin was unbroken. That touch so gentle it was almost tender sent awareness skittering across her nerves in a way that had nothing to do with pain. "Breathe," he said, his voice dropping lower, almost hypnotic. "Just breathe through it." She did, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing instead of the burning, focusing on the way his calloused fingers moved with shocking gentleness as he applied fresh gauze. He wrapped her wrists with the expertise of someone who'd treated battlefield wounds, securing the bandages with medical tape. But he didn't let go immediately. His fingers traced the edge of the gauze, following the line where damaged skin met whole, and Brenda saw something flicker across his face, something that looked disturbingly like hunger before he locked it down. He was fighting something, she realized, fighting the urge to touch more than just her injuries, fighting some internal war that made his shoulders tense and his breathing carefully controlled. When his gaze lifted to hers, she saw the conflict there. Saw him recognize that she wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a woman. Beautiful despite the trauma. And that awareness disgusted him even as it drew him closer. Brenda's eyes drifted to the gun on the counter, then back to his face. This man was a monster, she reminded herself. He killed people. He ran an empire built on violence and fear. But right now, in this moment, he was also the only thing standing between her and whatever darkness had tied her to that tree. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like something else entirely. Something that made her skin feel too tight and her breath come too fast. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Really?" Jae-hyuk's hands stilled on her wrists, his thumb pressed against her pulse point where her heart beat too quickly. He leaned in slightly, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. When he spoke, his voice was velvet over steel, intimate and absolutely lethal. "I'm the consequence of their mistake, Mrs. Moore. The men who hurt you made a calculation error. They thought you were alone in the world, that no one would come for you. They were wrong." His grip tightened fractionally, possessive and claiming. "Now you're mine to protect, mine to keep safe, mine to use to destroy everyone who thought they could touch what belongs under my watch." The way he said mine sent heat and ice warring through her veins. This wasn't rescue, this was possession. And the most terrifying part was how her body responded to it, how some primal part of her recognized the predator and wanted to submit to his protection even knowing the cost. Brenda pulled her hands back slowly, the fresh bandages stark white against her brown skin. The steam from the running water still hung in the air between them, making everything feel close and dangerous. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something that might break the intensity crackling in the space they shared. But the bathroom door opened without warning. Min-ho stood in the doorway, his face carefully blank but his eyes urgent. He spoke in rapid Korean, holding something small in his gloved hand, a device about the size of a coin. Black and innocuous looking. Jae-hyuk's entire demeanor changed in an instant, the intimacy of moments before replaced by cold, lethal focus. He stepped back from Brenda, putting professional distance between them, and took the device from his lieutenant. They conversed in Korean, Min-ho's tone clipped and precise, Jae-hyuk's responses getting quieter and more controlled with each exchange. Brenda watched the way Jae-hyuk's jaw clenched, the way his fingers tightened around the small device until his knuckles went white. Whatever that thing was, it meant something terrible. Finally, Jae-hyuk switched to English, his dark eyes finding Brenda's. "Where did you get your daughter's dress?" The question was so unexpected that Brenda blinked. "What?" It was a gift, from a neighbor after my husband died. She said her granddaughter had outgrown it." "Why?" Min-ho held up the device. "This is a GPS tracker, military grade. We found it sewn into the hem of Gianna's dress." The words didn't make sense at first. Brenda's brain tried to process them, tried to fit them into the nightmare that had become her life, but they wouldn't land. "That's impossible. She's worn that dress dozens of times. If there was something in it, I would have." "They put it there after they took you," Jae-hyuk said, his voice flat and cold. "They let your daughter run. They used her as bait." The realization hit Brenda like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself, her bandaged hands clumsy and painful. They wanted someone to find her, someone with money, someone they could. "Ransom," Min-ho finished. "Or rob, or both. You weren't the target, Mrs. Moore. The target was whoever stopped to help." "Oh God." Brenda's vision swam, nausea rising in her throat. "Gianna, they used my baby as a Judas goat." The term came from somewhere deep in her memory, something her husband had mentioned once about hunting using a tamed goat to lead wild ones into a trap. They'd turned her daughter into bait, sent her running down that mountain road knowing someone would eventually stop, someone wealthy enough to be worth the risk, and she'd led them straight to Kim Jae-hyuk. "We have to leave," Brenda said suddenly, pushing past Jae-hyuk toward the bedroom. "Right now. We endangered you. They know you helped us. They'll come here. We have to." She was moving on pure panic now, stumbling into the bedroom where Gianna sat on the floor playing with toys someone had given her. "Baby, get up. We're leaving. Now, Mama." Gianna's voice was small and confused. Brenda grabbed her daughter's hand, pulling her toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the elevator that would take them away from this place before whatever was coming arrived. Her heart hammered against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her system. every maternal instinct screaming that she had to get Gianna somewhere safe, somewhere far away from the violence she'd accidentally dragged into this man's life. She made it 3 steps into the hallway before Jae-hyuk appeared in front of her. He didn't grab her, didn't shout. He simply moved into her path with that supernatural speed, and suddenly Brenda was backing up, her body responding to the threat of his presence even as her mind tried to push forward. He advanced slowly, deliberately, each step forcing her backward until her spine hit the wall beside the elevator. Gianna had gone still and silent beside her, sensing the shift in the air. Jae-hyuk placed his hand on the wall next to Brenda's head, his palm flat against the expensive wallpaper, his arm creating a cage that trapped her without touching her. He leaned in close, so close she could see the dangerous light in his dark eyes, could smell that combination of sandalwood and threat that seemed to be his permanent signature. His other hand braced on the wall on her opposite side, boxing her in completely, his body a wall of controlled violence that made her breath catch. "You don't get to run," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected absolute obedience. "Not from this, not from me. They'll come for you," Brenda whispered, hating how her voice shook. "Because of us, because I brought this to your door." His smile was cold and absolutely without humor. "Let them come. Do you understand what you've done, Brenda? You got into the wrong car. The moment you fell into my arms in those woods, the moment I decided you were worth saving, you stopped being their problem and became mine." He leaned closer, his lips nearly brushing her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "You think the doors are locked to keep the world out? No, they're locked to keep you in. Because out there, you're prey. Every vulture in this city would pick your bones clean before sunrise. But in here, you're mine to guard." The possessiveness in his tone sent heat spiraling through her despite the fear, despite everything. She should be terrified. She was terrified, but underneath that fear was something else. Something that recognized the predator protecting her and responded in ways that made no logical sense. "I won't be your prisoner," she managed, though her voice lacked conviction. Jae-hyuk pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, and what she saw there made her breath stop. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous, absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that came from a man who'd never lost a war he chose to fight. "You're not my prisoner, Mrs. Moore. You're my responsibility. There's a difference." His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "And I protect what's mine. Always." Minho cleared his throat from down the hallway, breaking the moment. "Boss, we have movement. 3 vehicles approaching from the south. Unknown configuration." Jae-hyuk straightened but didn't step away, his body still creating that cage around Brenda that felt equal parts threatening and protective. "How long?" 10 minutes. Maybe less. Lock down the building. Full protocols. No one in or out without my authorization." Jae-hyuk finally stepped back, and Brenda could breathe again, could think past the overwhelming presence of him. He looked down at Gianna, his expression softening fractionally. "Go with Sun-hee. She'll take you somewhere safe inside the penthouse." The staff member appeared as if summoned, gently taking Gianna's hand. Brenda wanted to protest, wanted to keep her daughter close, but the look on Jae-hyuk's face told her this wasn't negotiable. When they were alone in the hallway, Jae-hyuk turned back to Brenda. "You wanted to know who I am? Now you're going to find out. Stay in your room, lock the door, and no matter what you hear, don't come out until I come for you." "What are you going to do?" His smile was beautiful and terrifying. "I'm going to teach them why you don't hunt what belongs to the Ice Architect." Brenda returned to her room as ordered, her hands shaking as she turned the lock. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city stretched out below, oblivious to whatever violence was about to unfold 30 stories above the streets. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, trying to steady her breathing, trying to process how her life had gone from normal to nightmare in less than 48 hours. Somewhere in this penthouse, Gianna was safe with Sun-hee. That was all that mattered. That had to be all that mattered. But her mind kept replaying the way Jae-hyuk had caged her against the wall, the possessiveness in his voice when he'd said, "mine," the heat in his eyes that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with something far more dangerous. An hour passed. Then 2. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She heard nothing from the hallway, no gunfire, no shouting, nothing that suggested 3 vehicles full of armed men had arrived looking for blood. The penthouse remained utterly quiet, which somehow made everything worse. Finally, footsteps approached her door. A knock, Mrs. Moore, the boss wants you in his office. It was Minho's voice, calm and professional. Brenda unlocked the door, finding the lieutenant waiting with his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to follow, leading her through hallways she hadn't seen before, past rooms with closed doors and guards stationed at intervals, men who watched her pass with the flat, assessing eyes of soldiers. They reached a set of double doors at the end of a corridor, and Minho pushed them open without knocking. Jae-hyuk's office was exactly what she expected, all dark wood and leather, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in Korean and English, a massive desk that looked hand-carved from a single piece of mahogany. But what dominated the space was the wall of monitors behind the desk, each screen showing different angles of the building, the street below, the parking garage, surveillance, control, power. Jae-hyuk stood at the windows, his back to her, still wearing that white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the dragon tattoos visible on his forearms. 3 other men were in the room, older, dressed in expensive suits, their faces hard and calculating. They looked at Brenda with the kind of cold assessment that made her feel like a commodity being evaluated. On the desk sat a leather-bound book, worn and water-stained, its pages dog-eared and marked with dozens of colored tabs. Even from across the room, Brenda recognized it. Her late husband's handwriting was visible on the exposed pages, his careful notations in the margins. "The vehicles?" Jae-hyuk asked without turning. "False alarm," Minho reported. "Delivery trucks. Wrong address." They turned around at the checkpoint. "Expand the perimeter anyway. Double the guard rotation." Jae-hyuk finally turned, his dark eyes finding Brenda's. "Come here." It wasn't a request. Brenda crossed the office on unsteady legs, stopping on the opposite side of the desk. Jae-hyuk gestured to the book. "Your husband kept excellent records, almost obsessively detailed. Do you know what this is?" "A ledger," Brenda said quietly. "He worked as a courier sometimes. Independent contractor. He never told me details, said it was safer if I didn't know." "Smart man." Jae-hyuk opened the book, turning pages filled with dates, names, amounts, routes. "This isn't just a debt ledger, Mrs. Moore. This is a map. Your husband was documenting smuggling routes through the Cascades routes that Hollis Vane has been selling to the highest bidder." He tapped a section marked with red tabs. "These entries here? They're transactions between Vane and a rival organization, the Vipers, a Korean syndicate based out of Vancouver that's been trying to expand into my territory for the past 3 years. One of the older men spoke, his English heavily accented. "By taking the woman, you've made yourself a target, Jae-hyuk. The Vipers will see this as opportunity. Vane will sell them information about your movements, your safe houses. You've given them an opening." Another man, gray-haired and cold-eyed, stepped forward. "The solution is simple. We return the woman to Vane with our apologies. Make it clear we had no knowledge of the ledger. The Vipers will back down. Vane gets what he wants, and we avoid a war we're not prepared to fight on 2 fronts." Brenda's blood went cold. They were talking about handing her over like she was a package that had been misdelivered. She looked at Jae-hyuk, trying to read his expression, trying to see any hint of what he was thinking. His face remained impassive, giving nothing away. "She's a liability," the gray-haired man continued, gesturing toward Brenda as if she weren't standing right there. "A civilian with a child. She knows nothing of value, and keeping her here puts everything we've built at risk. Cut our losses, make the trade." "And the girl?" Minho asked quietly. "Children are resilient. She'll forget." Brenda's hands clenched into fists, pain shooting through her bandaged wrists. "I won't let you take my daughter. I don't care what's in that book or who wants it. You'll have to kill me first." "No one is taking your daughter," Jae-hyuk said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He moved to his desk, pressing a button that made one of the monitors switch feeds. The screen showed a bedroom where Gianna slept peacefully in a bed too big for her small frame, Sun-hee sitting in a chair nearby, watching over her. "Look at her, Mrs. Moore. Safe, warm, protected. That child ran through a frozen forest barefoot because bad men hurt her mother. She stopped my convoy and begged for help, and I gave it." His eyes lifted to meet Brenda's, and what she saw there made her heart stutter. "I don't break promises to children." He turned to address his advisors, his tone dropping to something that carried absolute authority. "You want me to hand her back? To men who tied her to a tree like bait? To a militia leader who sells routes to my enemies? To the Vipers, who would use her to embarrass me, to show weakness?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only cold fury. "No, We don't negotiate with people who hurt women and use children as weapons. This will cost us," the gray-haired man said. "In blood and territory and alliances, the Vipers won't let this stand." "Good." Jae-hyuk picked up the ledger, holding it like a weapon. "Let them come. I've been waiting for an excuse to end them for 3 years. They just gave me one." He looked at each of his advisors in turn. "Burn the peace treaty. Mobilize our assets along the northern corridor. Contact our allies in Portland and San Francisco. Tell them it's time to choose sides." His gaze returned to the monitor, showing Brenda sleeping with her daughter. "We keep the woman, we keep the child, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally." The silence that followed was absolute. The advisors exchanged glances, some angry, some resigned, all recognizing that the decision had been made and nothing they said would change it. One by one, they filed out of the office, leaving only Minho, who lingered by the door. "You're choosing war over peace because of a woman you've known for 2 days," Minho said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jae-hyuk set the ledger down, his jaw tight. "I'm choosing war because they made it personal when they used that child as bait. Everything else is just strategy." Minho studied him for a long moment, then nodded and left, closing the doors behind him. Brenda stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. "You're going to war. Because you won't give me up." "I'm going to war because it was inevitable," Jae-hyuk corrected, moving around the desk to stand in front of her. "The Vipers and I have been circling each other for years. This just accelerates the timeline." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her bandaged wrist with surprising gentleness. "But make no mistake, Mrs. Moore. You're mine now. My responsibility, my problem, my war to fight. And I always win my wars." The next day unfolded in strange, suspended tension. The penthouse became a war room, men coming and going with tablets and encrypted phones, conversations in rapid Korean that Brenda couldn't follow but understood meant violence was being planned, strategies drawn, alliances called upon. Jae-hyuk moved through it all like a general preparing for battle, his white shirt eventually replaced by tactical black, his expression carved from ice. But he'd ordered Brenda and Gianna to stay, to remain in the living areas, and somehow that felt more significant than any declaration. Brenda found Gianna in the lounge late afternoon, standing before a black grand piano that looked like it cost more than their old house. Her daughter's small fingers pressed keys experimentally, creating discordant sounds that echoed through the vast space. Brenda was about to call her away when Jae-hyuk appeared in the doorway, watching. He'd shed the tactical gear, back in dark slacks and a charcoal shirt, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, those dragon tattoos seeming to move in the golden light filtering through the windows. "You play?" he asked Gianna, his voice gentler than Brenda had heard it. Gianna shook her head, suddenly shy. "I always wanted to. Mama said maybe someday when we had money for lessons." Jae-hyuk crossed the room with that controlled grace, settling onto the piano bench. He gestured for Gianna to sit beside him, and after a moment's hesitation, she did, her small frame dwarfed by his presence. "Watch," he said, and his fingers found the keys. What emerged was devastating. A complex, melancholy piece that filled the penthouse with beauty and sorrow intertwined, notes cascading like water over stone, building to crescendos that made Brenda's chest ache before falling away to whispers. He played with his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly, completely lost in the music. This wasn't a skill he'd learned recently. This was years of training, of discipline, of a boy who'd once had dreams before violence became his language. Brenda stood frozen in the doorway, watching this man who'd threatened war and caged her against walls, now teaching her daughter where to place her fingers. His voice patient as he explained timing and rhythm. The contrast shattered something in her defenses, made him human in ways that terrified her more than his coldness ever had. Because monsters were easy to hate, but this glimpse of who he might have been before the world made him into the ice architect, this was dangerous in ways she couldn't defend against. When the impromptu lesson ended and Sunhee took Gianna for dinner, Brenda found herself drawn to the balcony, needing air, needing space to think. The city sprawled below, lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over Seattle. She heard him approach before she saw him, that presence that made the air feel charged. "You play beautifully," she said without turning. "My mother insisted. She said music would keep me human when everything else tried to make me a weapon." Jae-hyuk moved to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell that combination of sandalwood and danger that seemed permanently etched into her memory. She was wrong. I don't think she was. Brenda turned to face him, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "I saw you with Gianna. That wasn't a weapon. That was... Don't." His voice carried a warning, rough and low. "Don't make me into something I'm not because I can play piano and tolerate children. I've killed men for less than what was done to you. I'll kill more before this is finished. That doesn't change because I showed your daughter where Middle C is." "I know what you are," Brenda whispered, but she didn't step back, didn't create the distance she should have. "You've made that very clear." "Do you?" He moved closer, crowding her against the railing, his hands gripping the metal on either side of her, creating that cage again that felt equal parts threat and sanctuary. The city lights behind him cast his face in shadow, made him look carved from darkness. "Because you're looking at me like you're forgetting. Like you're starting to see a man instead of a monster. Maybe I see both." Something flashed in his eyes, heat and hunger and conflict all tangled together. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to run, to do anything but stand there with her heart hammering and her skin feeling too sensitive. His breath ghosted across her cheek as he inhaled, breathing her in like she was something he needed to memorize. His lips hovered near her temple, then her cheekbone, mapping her face without touching, the restraint in every movement screaming louder than contact ever could. "If I kiss you, Brenda," he said against her ear, his voice dropping to gravel, "I ruin you. I'm made of sharp edges and violence, and the kind of darkness that stains everything it touches. You don't want this. You don't want me." But he didn't move away, and neither did she. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. His mouth was inches from hers, so close she could feel the heat, could see the war raging behind his eyes as he fought against whatever was pulling him toward her. Her hands lifted, hovering near his chest, torn between pushing him away and pulling him closer. The decision was made for them. An explosion lit up the night sky to the north, a bloom of orange and red that turned the darkness into day for 3 seconds before fading. The sound followed a deep rolling boom that rattled the windows and made car alarms scream in the streets below. Jae-hyuk pulled back instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from man to weapon in a heartbeat. His phone was already in his hand, Minho's voice crackling through before he could speak. "North Warehouse. They hit our distribution center." Jae-hyuk's jaw tightened, his eyes going absolutely cold as they met Brenda's. It started. Jae-hyuk moved through the penthouse like controlled chaos, barking orders in Korean, his men assembling with military precision. Brenda watched from the hallway as he strapped on tactical gear, vest, holster, knives sheathed at his thigh and shoulder. He checked his weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this countless times, each movement economical and deadly. When he looked up and found her watching, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what had almost happened on that balcony, of what still burned unfinished in the air. "Stay with Gianna," he said. "Minho remains here with half the team. You'll be safe. Where are you going?" His smile was cold and beautiful and absolutely merciless. "To end this before it begins." He left without another word, taking 6 men with him, disappearing into the elevator like shadows swallowed by deeper shadow. Brenda returned to the monitor room where Minho stood watching multiple screens, his expression grim. She shouldn't watch. Shouldn't want to see what Jae-hyuk became when he stopped pretending to be civilized. But she couldn't look away. The feed switched to helmet cameras, showing the interior of moving vehicles, then darkness as they traveled north into the mountains. Snow had started falling, thick and heavy, turning the world into a white void broken only by headlights. They were heading back toward the Cascades, back toward the wilderness where this had all started. Hollis Vane's compound was exactly what Brenda expected, a fortified hunting lodge surrounded by razor wire and guard towers, trucks parked in military formation, men with rifles patrolling the perimeter. It looked like a small army had dug in, ready for siege. But Jae-hyuk didn't lay siege. He infiltrated. The feeds went dark as his team cut the power, plunging the compound into blackness. Then thermal imaging kicked in, painting the world in green and white, showing heat signatures scrambling in confusion. Jae-hyuk moved through that chaos like a phantom, his suppressed weapon making sounds like whispered death, bodies dropping without screams, without warning. He was surgical, efficient, terrifying in his precision. This wasn't rage. This was art. Brenda watched, her hands pressed against her mouth, unable to reconcile this creature of violence with the man who'd played piano for her daughter, who'd bandaged her wrists with gentle hands, who'd almost kissed her like she was something precious. But both versions were real. Both versions were him. The team moved deeper into the compound, neutralizing resistance with brutal efficiency. They reached the main lodge, and Jae-hyuk kicked in the door, his weapon leading. The helmet camera showed a large room hunting trophies on the walls, a fire burning in a stone hearth, and there, behind a massive desk, sat Hollis Vane. The militia leader was exactly as Gianna had described, a crude snake tattoo crawling up his throat, his face all hard angles and harder violence. He reached for a shotgun mounted on the wall behind him, but Jae-hyuk crossed the distance in 3 strides, his hand clamping around Vane's wrist with enough force to make bones grind. The shotgun clattered to the floor. "Sit down," Jae-hyuk said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made disobedience impossible. Vane sat, his eyes calculating, already looking for angles. "You're making a mistake. I have connections. The Vipers." "The Vipers are why you're still breathing," Jae-hyuk interrupted, circling the desk like a predator assessing prey. "I want them to know what happens when someone touches what's mine. I want them to see the message written in your blood." "This is about the woman?" Vane laughed, the sound ugly and mocking. "Jesus Christ, you started a war over some random." The sentence ended in a scream as Jae-hyuk's knife punched through Vane's hand, pinning it to the wooden armrest of his chair. Blood welled around the blade, dark and viscous. Jae-hyuk leaned close, his voice dropping to something that barely qualified as human. "You tied her to a tree. You used her child as bait. You left a 7-year-old girl to run barefoot through the snow because you thought it would be profitable." He twisted the knife slightly, and Vane whimpered. "I don't care about your connections or your politics or whatever deal you made with the Vipers. I care about the rope burns on her wrists. I care that she flinched when I tried to help her because men like you taught her that help comes with conditions." He pulled the knife free with a wet sound, wiping the blade on Vane's shirt before sheathing it. Then he pulled something from his pocket, the GPS tracker they'd found in Gianna's dress, small and black and innocuous looking. Vane's eyes went wide with recognition and dawning horror. "You wanted to track people. You wanted to use technology to find your victims." Jae-hyuk grabbed Vane's jaw, forcing his mouth open, and shoved the tracker inside, holding it closed until Vane had no choice but to swallow. "Now you're the one being tracked. The Vipers know you've been skimming from their shipments. I made sure they received the ledger pages that prove it. The FBI knows about your weapons trafficking anonymous tip. Very detailed. The DEA is very interested in your distribution network." He released Vane's jaw, stepping back. "You wanted to be found? Now the whole world will find you. And when they do, they'll discover exactly what happens to men who hurt children." Jae-hyuk turned and walked out, leaving Vane tied to that chair with his own sins literally inside him, waiting for the consequences to arrive. The feed went dark as the team extracted, moving back through the snow like ghosts, leaving carnage in their wake. Back in the penthouse, Brenda watched the monitors go black. When Jae-hyuk finally stepped out of the elevator 2 hours later, blood spattered across his tactical vest but his face calm. She was waiting. He stopped when he saw her, their eyes meeting across the space, and something unspoken passed between them. He'd gone to war for her, had become a monster to protect what he'd claimed as his, and God help her, she found it intoxicating. The penthouse fell into heavy silence after his men dispersed, each moving to their posts or to rest after the violence. Jae-hyuk stood in the entryway, still wearing that blood-spattered tactical vest, his dark eyes locked on Brenda with an intensity that made the air between them feel combustible. Snow melted in his hair, droplets sliding down his temple like tears the ice architect would never shed. He looked like war, personified, beautiful and terrible and absolutely lethal. Brenda should have been terrified, should have taken Gianna and demanded to leave, to be anywhere but in the presence of a man who'd just orchestrated calculated violence without hesitation. But instead, she found herself walking toward him, closing the distance between them with steps that felt both inevitable and dangerous. "You killed for me," she said quietly. Not a question, a statement of fact that hung between them like smoke. "I killed because they made it necessary." Jae-hyuk's voice was rough, edged with something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Because men like Vane don't understand mercy, only consequences. You made yourself a target, started a war with the Vipers. All of this because you wouldn't hand me over." He moved then, closing the remaining distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with surprising gentleness despite the violence still clinging to him like a second skin. His calloused thumbs traced her cheekbones, and Brenda's breath caught at the contrast those same hands that had wielded knives and weapons now touching her like she was something precious, something that might break if handled wrong. "You still don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to something intimate and dangerous. The moment you fell into my arms in those woods, you became mine. Not property, not a possession. Mine to protect, mine to keep safe, mine to avenge." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and Brenda could feel the tension vibrating through his body, the restraint it took for him not to close that final distance. "I would burn this entire city down before I let anyone hurt you again." The declaration should have sounded like a threat. Instead, it felt like a vow, dark and binding and absolute. Brenda's hands came up to grip his vest, feeling the Kevlar beneath her fingers, the solid reality of him standing there covered in the evidence of what he'd done in her name. Her honey-colored eyes met his dark ones, and she saw the war raging there, the man who wanted to kiss her battling the monster who believed he'd only destroy her. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, and realized it was true. She should be. Any sane woman would be. But standing there in his arms, feeling the way he held her like she was both fragile and fierce, she found only certainty. "I'm afraid of how much I want this. Want you, even knowing what you are." Something broke in his expression, that iron control fracturing just enough to show the hunger underneath. His hand slid into her hair, fingers tangling in the dark strands, tilting her head back to expose the vulnerable line of her throat. He leaned in, his lips hovering over her pulse point, and she felt him inhale deeply, breathing her in like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. "If we do this," he said against her skin, his voice barely above a growl, "there's no going back. You become mine in every way that matters. I don't share. I don't let go. I protect what's mine with everything I have. And Brenda," he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, and what she saw there made her knees weak. "I will ruin you for any other man. You'll never be free of me." She should have been afraid of that promise, should have recognized the obsession in his words, the dangerous possessiveness. But all she felt was heat and need, and the reckless certainty that she'd already made her choice the moment she'd stopped being terrified of him and started seeing him whole. "Then ruin me," she breathed. The kiss, when it finally came, was devastating. Not gentle, not tentative. It was claiming and consuming and absolutely inevitable. His mouth crashed against hers with all the pent-up tension of days spent circling each other. All the violence and gentleness and contradictions that made him who he was pouring into that contact. Brenda kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his vest, pulling him closer despite the blood and the danger, and every rational thought screaming that this was insanity. He tasted like mint and danger and something darker she couldn't name, but found herself craving. His hands were everywhere, her face, her hair, her waist touching her like he was memorizing her through sensation alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers again, his eyes closed, his control visibly fraying. The ice architect had melted, and what remained was a man who'd found something worth protecting beyond empires and territories, something worth keeping. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward his private quarters, and Brenda didn't protest, didn't hesitate. She'd made her choice in that forest when she fell into his arms. Everything since had been inevitable, and that, my ruthless romantics, is how the ice architect paid his debt. If Jay Hugh's dark obsession gave you chills, do not leave without hitting that like button. Let's aim for 5,000 likes if you want more protectors like him. Subscribe and ring that bell because next week, we're diving into a story even darker than this one. And I need to know your thoughts in the comments. If you were Brenda, would you have run from the safe house? Or would you have let the Mafia boss lock you in? Let me know down below. Until next time, stay dangerous.